Hello out there, I'm RG, a writer, reader, and lover of all things written word adjacent. Today specifically, that means we're talking about books, and even more specifically, the books that I read in January. Last month I made a video with my reading plans for January, and I predicted that I'd be able to get through about 4 books, and I made a stretch goal for 7. It turns out that I know myself really well, because 4 is exactly the number of books we were able to read this time around. I did have 10 non-reading days in January, and that's because I hit a little bit of a reading slump. Not the best way to start the year, but that's okay. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. As with all my videos, there are timestamps in the description below, so feel free to hop around to whatever content you find the most interesting. So in January, like I said, I read 4 books and I started a 5th. The 4 books that I completed were 2 fiction books, a romance and a thriller, as well as 2 nonfiction books which were about writing or being a writer. The first book that I read was Steven Pressfield's The War of Art. Break through the blocks and win your inner creative battles. Steven Pressfield, I believe, wrote The Legend of Bagger Vance, which was made into a movie. I never saw the movie, but apparently it did very well. The book itself is fairly short. It's only 165 pages, and each of the sections within the book are very short as well. So, for example, you can see this little section right here is 1 paragraph. So, bite-sized, easy to read, very focused book. The thrust of the book is that within every creative, there are internal forces that prevent us from doing the thing that we love to do, our craft. He calls this resistance. Resistance is everywhere in everything. It is a repellent force. It is often taking the shape of things like procrastination, because procrastination is very easy to rationalize. If you're a procrastinator, you don't think to yourself, I'm not going to write my symphony. You think, I'm going to write my symphony, just not today. And that is one of the most pervasive forms of resistance. He also talks about other aspects of our psychology that can make resistance even stronger, such as self-doubt or fear. He says fear is a good sign. It tells us that we're working on the right project, because the more fear we have about something not succeeding, the more that means that it's something that we really value and care about. He splits the book up into 3 sections. The first is defining resistance, the second is combating resistance, and the third is about beyond resistance. As a writer, I personally found that the first section was very helpful to me because it helped me to understand the different thoughts and excuses that I make for myself when I should be writing but am not, and identifying those in order to more clearly be able to fight them. You have to know your enemy before you can defeat it, right? I'll share a few of the quotes that I like from it. He begins the book by describing what his usual morning routine is before he sits down to write, and ends that passage with the following quote. How many pages have I produced? I don't care. Are they any good? I don't even think about it. All that matters is I've put in my time and hit it with all I've got. All that counts is that, for this day, for this session, I have overcome resistance. He also addresses some other concerns that pair well with resistance, like receiving criticism or having a lot of self-doubt. He says the counterfeit innovator is wildly self-confident. The real one is scared to death. But fear is not supposed to prevent us from working on our craft. Fear is a good sign. It's something that is telling you that you are working on something that is going to be monumental for you. In the second section, he talks about pros versus amateurs. He says that aspiring artists defeated by resistance are all thinking like amateurs, and that in order to overcome that, you need to be able to think like a pro. So this second section of the book is about developing the mindset of a professional. It's about the decision to turn pro as an act of will, something that you can decide right now and begin to act on immediately. I'll read a section for you. This is titled, A Professional. Someone asked Somerset Maugham if he wrote on a schedule or only when he struck by inspiration. I write only when inspiration strikes, he replied. Fortunately, it strikes every morning at 9 o'clock sharp. That's a pro. In terms of resistance, Maugham was saying, I despise resistance. I will not let it faze me. I will sit down and do my work. Maugham reckoned another deeper truth, that by performing the mundane physical act of sitting down and starting to work, he set in motion a mysterious but infallible sequence of events that would produce inspiration as surely as if the goddess had synchronized her watch with his. He knew if he built it, she would come. So Stephen Pressfield is a huge advocate of the sit down and do a little something every single day approach, as opposed to the big sprint, big binge creative approach. In the third section of the book, which is Beyond Resistance, I found it a little bit esoteric for my tastes. He talks about Jungian psychology, the ego and the self. He talks about fear. He talks about invoking the muses. He even talks about angels in the abstract sense as the forces that help us to complete our work or support us during our work. Not my favorite part of the book. I think the first two sections were a lot more immediately useful, at least for my experience as a writer and creative. While I did find this book to be a good tool and motivational overall, I will caution that I do have some trigger warnings to share for this, and it feels very odd to share trigger warnings for a book which purports to be about overcoming creative blocks. However, there are two sections in particular, resistance and self-medication and resistance and victimhood, which are on pages 26, 27, and 28 of the book, which address neurodivergence, mental health, and mental illness, and frame them as expressions of resistance rather than actual conditions. If this kind of content is triggering for you, I would recommend skipping it. I remember when I was reading it, as someone with ADHD and anxiety myself, I was pretty upset. These are quite old-fashioned ways of thinking about mental health and mental illness and their impacts on our daily lives and our abilities to engage in the things that we enjoy doing. So in a sense, I can understand why he wants to ascribe them to resistance. However, it's not the kind of thing that you can just say like, well, I'm just going to get over it, right? Like, executive dysfunction is a real thing, and sometimes you cannot just sit down and do the thing, right? So I remember when I was reading through the section that I was a little upset myself. But trigger warnings aside, I did find this to be quite a motivational book, and I do see myself going back to it periodically to sort of refresh my definitions of resistance to make it easier to identify and deal with when the moment arises. Overall, I would give this book a 3-star rating. Like I said, it is a very quick read. It is pretty motivational, and it has some useful reminders about resistance and our own internal propensity to avoid things that make us uncomfortable or that we care about too much, because then we worry about failing. However, like I said, the whole third section of the book didn't do very much for me, and I don't particularly enjoy the mental health, mental illness takes that the author shares. So 3 stars with a soft recommendation for people who want something quick to read that is a 1-2 punch of motivation when they are in need of an external push. That's the word. The second book that I read in January was Lisa Gardner's The Neighbor. Now, this was the book that put me into a 10-day reading slump. I started reading it with such high hopes because I was looking forward to a detective thriller. However, I have a lot of things about this book that I strongly disliked. Let me just reread the back cover for you for some context. A young mother, blonde and pretty, vanishes from her South Boston home, leaving behind only one witness, her 4-year-old daughter, and one suspect, her handsome, secretive husband. From the moment Detective Sergeant D.D. Warren arrives at the Joneses' snug little bungalow, instinct tells her that something is seriously off with the wholesome image the couple has worked so hard to create. With the clock ticking on the life of a missing woman and a media firestorm building, Dee must decide whether Jason Jones is hiding his guilt or just trying to hide. But first she must stand between a potential killer and his next victim, an innocent child who may have seen too much. Doesn't that sound so good? It sounds so good. But then you read the book and you get halfway through and you realize that almost nothing has progressed in the investigation. And, okay, hold on. Let me just start over real quick with some basics. So this book is written with multiple POV characters, and those POVs are written with multiple viewpoints. So we have Dee Dee's sections, which are in close limited third person, as well as point of view scenes from the two main suspects, which are also in close limited third. And then we also have periodic excerpts from either like a diary or the victim's personal retelling or recounting of events in her past, and those are written in the first person. What that means is that we get a lot of backstory and exposition throughout the novel, which is good up to a point, because you get to the 50% mark of the book and you realize everything that you know about the case, and it's a lot, is nothing that the detective herself knows, because it's all done through exposition through the POVs of the two suspects and the victim. The actual investigation doesn't seem to progress at all until past the 50% mark of the book, which is incredibly frustrating, because when you are reading a detective thriller, your hope is that the detective takes an active part in unraveling the case and that there's some sort of personal stake or involvement with the case. However, that is not the case here. I will also mention that Dee Dee Warren, while initially a charming character, does have some personality quirks that I don't particularly enjoy. She falls into this noir trap of objectifying all of the people around her. She has kind of a toxic relationship with an ex that shows up periodically throughout the novel. And she also says a lot of things or thinks a lot of things which are very strongly coded for internalized misogyny. And I just didn't need that. You know, the hope when you pick up a thriller written by a female author with a female main character is that you'll be able to escape some of the misogyny that is so prevalent in noir and the detective genre in general. It was just sort of perpetuated, except through a softer lens, thanks to the fact that Dee Dee's a woman. So overall, in terms of pacing, I found it incredibly slow. In terms of story, I was not very satisfied. Characterization was very strong, I will say that. All the characters' voices were very distinct. I was not a particular fan of Dee Dee Warren. However, I will say that, you know, the author does challenge the reader by putting us into the POVs of some of these characters who are not very palatable, and does it in a way that makes us, you know, challenge our own perceptions or preconceived notions about other people, which I'll give her credit for that. But that's really the only thing that I can give her credit for with this book. This is a solid 1-star review. I struggled to get through this thing so much. I do not recommend it to anyone. I don't think I will read any of Lisa Gardner's other books. This was not for me. I was very sad about this, and this was the first fiction book that I wanted to read this year, so it was really, really, really disappointing. I don't know that this book tackles any themes well enough for me to want to share them as prevalent, so I will share the content warnings instead, and there are a lot. It includes graphic child abuse, sexual assault, sexual violence. It also mentions and discusses pedophilia, abortion, and suicide, as well as some minor references to incest and the fallout of that. It also discusses infidelity, dishonesty with your partner, family trauma, Munchausen by proxy, and a few other things. So, yeah, not a great book. Don't read it. Just don't read it. The next book was an oasis after that mess. This was DIY MFA by Gabriela Pereira. The premise of this book is that, you know, for whatever reason, people aren't always able to go to a Master's of Fine Arts program to pursue that degree. You know, whether it's tuition costs or time commitments, family responsibilities, whatever. You may want to do it, but you don't necessarily have the opportunity to do it. So this book is a self-guided approach to learn the skills that you would learn through an MFA program. It breaks down MFA programs into 3 different components that they teach in order to create successful graduates, and those include writing, reading, and then building community. And then on the page teaches the strategies that you would need in order to develop skills in each of those areas. In general, I would say that this book takes a nice no-nonsense approach towards what it's trying to teach. There's not a lot of fluff. It's pretty direct and straightforward with the concepts and then specific exercises or tasks that it wants you to do in order to try to develop those. However, there are some sections that I read that I was like, this doesn't make a lot of sense. I will say that she does fall into the trap of doing something that is just like a personal pet peeve for me in nonfiction books that are about teaching specific skills, which is she will explain a skill through anecdote or analogy, but then not directly address how that applies to the skill specifically that you're trying to build. So, for example, she has a section about developing or growing your ideas. Now, I will say I had a lot of problems with this section specifically because I don't see how any of these are idea development, but that's okay. Maybe that's just me. I even Googled it to see if anyone was talking about this, but like, no. Okay, so she also loves her acronyms. So her 3 I's for developing or growing your ideas include imitation, improvisation, and incubation. Now, first of all, imitation is choosing an author whose voice or style you admire and then copying a paragraph of one of their stories longhand in order to sort of absorb the flow and the rhythm, the voice, the word choice, etc. yourself. Great. I don't see how that grows or develops ideas that you have, but cool. Okay, that's one. The second one is the one that I'm talking about in particular here is improvisation. So she spends this whole section on improvisation talking about how she learned to improvise when she was learning how to play violin. And then she says, once you have imitation figured out, improvisation is a breath away. You may be able to improvise without even realizing it. At first, it might be a small change, a wrong note that leads to another, and yet another, until you're making the piece all your own. What I am assuming she wants you to do here is take the paragraph that you've copied in someone else's style and then make changes to it in order to do something, I'm assuming. I don't know. But again, that's not developing your own ideas, right? That's like messing with somebody else's style in order to like learn skills through their writing, which is great, but not what she's talking about. And then B, it's just like so abstract. Like what are we learning here? Like what is the actual skill? What am I doing? What am I improvising? How am I improvising? I thought writing was improvising just in general. I just don't understand. This just does not apply. Okay. And then the third one, the third I was incubation, which is basically when you let something sit for a while and then you come back to it later, which again is a good thing to do because perspective can help with your writing. However, I don't see how that actively develops or grows ideas. Anyway, so it does have like 1 or 2 sections like that, and it's only 1 or 2 sections that are like that, which really were very puzzling to me. However, in general, I would say that it is a very useful book. It talks a lot about strategy. It talks a lot about mindset. It talks a lot about iteration, and iteration is something that I'm very interested in, and I was actually planning on doing a series about iterating my writing process, and that's the reason that I picked this book up, because I heard that it had a lot to do with iteration. So I do think this useful in that respect, and it is very motivating and inspiring, but, you know, it wasn't perfect, which is why 4 stars is all that it gets from me. I do recommend this to people who are interested in developing their skill sets, developing their own character as a writer. This sort of has the practical aspect that I thought that Dorothea Brand's book, Becoming a Writer, which I read last month, was missing. So it does have a lot of practical information in here. In particular, the first couple of chapters were great for the discussion of iteration. But again, yeah, 4 stars. 4 stars. The next book that I read was Aaron Sterling's The Kiss Curse. This is a paranormal romance. It's a short read, very quick to get through, which was great because I really needed a win after struggling to get through The Neighbor. This is about Gwyn Jones, who is a witch in a small town full of witches called Graves Glen. She runs a witchcraft shop. It's not really like a magical items shop. It's more like a novelty, new age type shop for the tourists that come into town. And her family, the Joneses, are the witch family whose magic runs the town. The town's magic used to come from the Penhallow family, who primarily live in Wales, but there was a change in regime in the previous book in the series, which I did not realize that this was a book in a series. It's a follow-up to the X-Hex, which was written beforehand. So there were some world-building things that did not get explained in this book, which I think were explained in the previous one. But having gotten through like 60% of the book and then all of a sudden there's like this world-building thing that I don't quite understand was a little annoying. Sorry, small aside. Back to the story. So the Jones family now runs the magic that runs the town, and whenever there's a change in regime, from the Penhallows to the Joneses, for example, there are bad actors who come into town to try and take advantage of that instability and use the magic for their own nefarious reasons. There are some small town, you've got mail vibes to it, in which they are rival businesses. Gwyn runs her magic shop, and then across the street, Wells Penhallow from Wales moves back into town, and he is opening his own magic shop. And so there's a rivals to lovers aspect to the story, which was a little fun. And then there's also forced proximity, grumpy sunshine. There's a couple of different romance tropes that show up in this book. The book is written in alternating close limited third person, and the POV characters are Gwyn and Wells, so you get insight into both of their opinions about each other as their rivalry progresses into a romance. And the secondary characters in the book are all pretty well fleshed out and interesting. They have their own voices, they have their own interests. They're pretty rich, which is great because the secondary characters in a lot of romance novels are really often very flat or uninteresting, not actually feeling like people, but that wasn't the case in this book. I also liked that they were central to the character development of the protagonist. A lot of times you will see that the romance is the thing that causes the character to change. There are subtle changes in Gwyn's character throughout the text of the novel, which change as a result of her interaction with the secondary characters instead of with the love interest, which I think is great. As for Gwyn and Wells themselves, Gwyn is the primary main character. She's the female main character, and she does have some character traits that I don't particularly enjoy. For my protagonists, I find her often very impulsive. She is an adult who often acts like a child. Sometimes her rejection of authority is very knee-jerk and not well thought out. Like, it's good to question authority and to be critical of authority, but I do think that sometimes, things are the way they are for a reason, or people tell you to do things for a reason, and the knee-jerk reaction shouldn't be defiance. It should be to think about it and then be defiant, right? Like, let's use our critical thinking skills here. So in some ways I did find her a little bit annoying, but she did improve on me throughout the course of the book. Wells was fine from the beginning. He wasn't the most compelling male love interest I've ever read, but he was fine. The romance itself progressed very organically. I thought it was really nicely done. In terms of spice level, I'd say that this is kind of a softer one. There is more than one scene that contains sexual content. However, it's not terribly, terribly graphic, I would say. This book touches on themes of responsibility, community, family, honesty versus dishonesty, and also even some professional ethics, which I think is interesting. In terms of content warnings, like I said, it does have some sexual content. It does feature kidnapping. There is blood and violence, alcohol use, death of a family member, as well as fire, injury, and torture. Those last three I would say are very mild. Overall, I'd say this book is a strong 3. I thought it was enjoyable. It was a very quick read, and the author surprised me with how well constructed the story was. However, like I said, there were some character things that I wasn't particularly fond of, and I wouldn't say that this is the kind of story that sticks with you for any particular period of time. It was kind of like fast food. You eat it and it's tasty while you're eating it, but then it's not necessarily something that you would write in your diary about. It's quick, it's enjoyable. You put it down and you forget about it. So strong 3. I would recommend this if you need something light and quick to turn around after a little bit of a reading slump. Maybe avoid it if you're not particularly fond of spicy scenes, but I wouldn't necessarily say that the spice in this book was egregious. Okay. And then the last book that I started in January but have yet to finish, it'll be my first book for next month, was The Successful Novelist. I got to about the 50% mark on this book, so I'm going to give myself credit for that. I'll talk about that more in detail with next month's reading wrap-up. The one thing I did want to share with you guys, the reason that I did not meet my 3 videos per month goal in January, aside from, having been sick and the end of the holidays and all that stuff, is because I actually spent quite a bit of time doing a hardcover rebind for a gift for my spouse. So I wanted to show you because I'm really proud of it. This month, February, is spouse's birthday. So in January, I asked them, what's your favorite book? And the answer was The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. So I bought it in softcover. And then, with all of my crafting know-how, I made a custom hardcover book of it. So it's got some nice painted edges made to look a little bit like a galaxy. It has this gorgeous little moon ribbon bookmark that comes through the bottom of the book, and it's in there. And I custom designed and cut out and ironed on this metallic transfer for the cover, and it's in a faux leather binding. There's no animal parts involved. And I'm just going to cover this with my hand so you don't see any names, but there's a little book plate under my fingers. These are the space-related end papers. And then here is the other side of the end papers. Look how neat. Look how neat. Yeah. It's not perfect. This is the first book that I've ever bound, but I am pretty proud of it. I think I did a really good job. And the most important part for me is that spouse really loved it. Got super, super, super choked up about it, which was exactly what I wanted. So this was the project that kept me busy all of last month. There's the back. Did I show you the back? Yeah, that's the back. If you are interested in learning how to do your own bookbinding, there are a bunch of channels that teach how to do it. The channel that I referenced the most for my own little binding adventure was Abound Bindery. They have a bookbinding 101 series, which is super, super easy to follow. Very, very good. Definitely watch it a few times before you start trying to do any of the bookbinding. That will save you a lot of heartache in the long run. Anyway, so here's my little precious, but I promise I'll be around more this month. So thank you so much for keeping me company while I talk about the books that I read in January. I would love to hear about any books that you read and enjoyed and recommend. Please let me know in the comments below so that I can add them to my TBR list. I enjoy reading from every kind of genre, so don't be shy. And the videos that I have planned next for the channel include that introduction video for the Iterating the Process series for the writing that I was discussing earlier, as well as a BookTube newbie tag video. And those two, along with this video, will be my 3 videos for February. And then next month, obviously, we'll do a wrap-up video for February's reading, as well as a bullet journaling video about the common bullet journaling practices that I do not personally use in my own bullet journal. So that's what's coming up next. Again, thank you so much for spending your time with me today. It was nice chatting. Come back again soon. Yes? Yes? All right. Bye-bye.